Some people manipulate with words, others manipulate with emotions, and the most dangerous ones manipulate without you even noticing, because manipulation rarely looks aggressive. It looks calm, helpful, charming, trustworthy, and that is what makes it dangerous. In The 48 Laws of Power, Robert Greene explains that influence is often built through subtle psychological control, not force, not violence, but understanding, human weakness. Tonight, you will understand the hidden psychology behind manipulation, how manipulators gain trust, how they control emotions, and why most people never realize they are being controlled until it is too late. Manipulators do not control everyone equally. First, they study people, your insecurities, your loneliness, your desires, your fears, because every human being has an emotional doorway. And once someone discovers it, control becomes easier. In The Art of Seduction, Robert Greene explains that manipulators observe carefully before acting. They learn what people desperately want: attention, validation, love, importance. Then they offer exactly that, not because they care, but because emotional dependence creates influence. Humans naturally trust certainty, even when certainty is false. That is why confident people often appear intelligent, even when they are wrong. Manipulators understand this deeply. They speak calmly, directly, without hesitation, because confidence itself becomes persuasive. In psychology, the human brain associates certainty with leadership and uncertainty with weakness. That is why many people follow strong voices without questioning them. The most effective manipulation is emotional, because once someone becomes emotionally dependent, logic disappears. Manipulators first create comfort, attention, affection, understanding. Then slowly, they begin controlling emotions by giving attention and taking it away, creating emotional highs. Then, emotional distance. This pattern creates psychological addiction. The brain starts chasing approval, and eventually, the victim stops thinking clearly. Not all manipulation sounds aggressive. Sometimes, manipulation sounds like disappointment. After everything I did for you, I guess you never cared. You changed. Manipulators use guilt, because guilt weakens resistance. Humans naturally fear feeling selfish, and manipulators exploit that fear. In The Laws of Human Nature, Robert Greene explains that emotional pressure often controls people more effectively than force, because emotional guilt makes people surrender willingly. Control becomes easier when people feel alone. That is why manipulators slowly isolate individuals from friends, from family, from outside opinions, because isolation removes perspective, and without perspective, manipulation becomes harder to detect. This technique appears repeatedly in cult psychology, toxic relationships, and authoritarian leadership, because once one voice becomes dominant, critical thinking begins to disappear. Most humans would rather feel accepted than free. That is what manipulators understand. Humans fear rejection deeply because rejection triggers psychological pain. So manipulators create conditions where approval feels conditional. If you obey, you receive affection. If you resist, you receive distance. Over time, people begin changing themselves to avoid losing approval without realizing their behavior is now controlled. Confused people are easier to control. That is why manipulators constantly change behavior. One day kind, the next day cold. One moment supportive, the next moment distant. This inconsistency creates emotional instability, and unstable people seek clarity desperately. The manipulator then becomes the source of both pain and comfort, which creates dependency, because the confused mind stops resisting and starts chasing reassurance instead. Most humans would rather feel accepted than free. That is what manipulators understand. Humans fear rejection deeply because rejection triggers psychological pain, so manipulators create conditions where approval feels conditional. If you obey, you receive affection. If you resist, you receive distance. Over time, people begin changing themselves to avoid losing approval without realizing their behavior is now controlled. Confused people are easier to control. That is why manipulators constantly change behavior. One day kind, the next day cold. One moment supportive, the next moment distant. This inconsistency creates emotional instability, and unstable people seek clarity desperately. The manipulator then becomes the source of both pain and comfort, which creates dependency because the confused mind stops resisting and starts chasing reassurance instead. Most people think manipulation requires words. Sometimes silence is enough. Ignoring messages, withholding attention, creating emotional distance. These silent actions trigger anxiety because the human brain fears uncertainty. Manipulators understand this. They know silence forces people to overthink, and overthinking creates emotional vulnerability. That is why strategic silence can become psychological control. One of the oldest psychological techniques is mirroring. Manipulators copy your interests, your values, your emotions, your speaking style, because similarity creates trust. Humans naturally feel safer around people who appear familiar. This technique is heavily discussed in behavioral psychology because familiarity lowers suspicion, and lowered suspicion creates access. The victim believes, "This person understands me," without realizing the connection was carefully designed. The most dangerous manipulators rarely appear threatening. They appear helpful, charming, patient, trustworthy, because obvious manipulation is easy to detect. But hidden manipulation feels safe. That is why intelligent manipulators avoid force. They prefer emotional influence because people resist pressure, but they surrender willingly to comfort. And by the time the manipulation becomes visible, the emotional control already exists. That is the frightening reality of human psychology. The greatest manipulators do not control your actions first. They control your emotions. And once emotions are controlled, behavior follows naturally.